I became involved in the diplomatic corps because in just the pre-1939 years, I was doing an honours degree in modern languages at Edinburgh University. And in your third year, the Foreign Service used to visit and interview students who were doing well on course and ask them if they were interested in a career in the diplomatic corps. And I said I was, and they said that this would entail going to the two countries whose languages you were studying and spending time there, 6 months in each, teaching in one of their schools, a school of their choice, and brushing up your foreign language. Well, I grew up with a father who was in the Royal Flying Corps in World War I, and inevitably some of this rubbed off. And much to my mother's disgust, who was very much opposed to me being involved, but she died when I was 13, and so I was more or less free to make my own choice. And my father's influence was considerable. In fact, he took me up flying with him at the age when I was about 8 years old. And that left a tremendous impression, of course. And I was very keen to follow it up. And of course, to a young person, it's a very glamorous life, or it appears as such, put it that way. On the day war was declared, I was sitting in the city of Munich in Germany, spending a weekend just relaxing, and I was asleep in my little hotel there when at 6 o'clock in the morning there was a thunderous knock at the door, and the SS came in. There were two officers and a lady interpreter. Although I spoke German, she insisted on speaking English, and said our countries were at war, which was not technically true because this was 6 in the morning and war wasn't declared till 11 o'clock. But that's academic, really. And I was arrested there and then and taken immediately to an SS, well, you'd call it a jail rather than a prison, and incarcerated for 3 days. And they had really removed my clothes, my books, my money, and my car. So everything had gone. And I didn't expect to see any of it again. And really, I thought I was in for the rest of the war, frankly. That was what appalled me. But what I hadn't realized and hadn't been told was that there were 60 British students doing what I was doing, scattered throughout Germany, but there were 60 Germans doing the same in England. And after 3 days, we were exchanged through the Red Cross in Switzerland. I was told that to get ready, but the next day I would be taken to the Swiss frontier and exchanged, which was a total surprise to me. And I was put into a very large SS car with an SS lieutenant, and there was just a little square window at the back. And on the way I looked out, and there was my MG Magnet being driven behind us with an SS sergeant whose head was right over the whole windscreen. And we had, I suppose, about 80 miles to go. And when we got to the frontier, he got out, he said, "You can get out now." And there was a bridge across a ravine, and the Swiss were on the far side. And he said, "They're expecting you, and you can take your car." And I said, "Why are you giving me my car? You've taken all my clothes, my books, my money." And he said, this is very Teutonic, in German, he said, "Because we have no spares." Anyway, they stood at their end with submachine gun in their hand, And I was walking across the bridge, and the Swiss was standing at the other end with a submachine gun in their hand. And it wasn't a very comfortable feeling. And the Swiss actually were quite aggressive when I got there, because they may have been expecting me in upper quarters, but this guard had no idea what was going on. And he put me into a room which was no bigger than a telephone booth, and kept me there till he contacted his superior somewhere and got instructions to let me go. Or they came and collected me and took me to Bern. When I got to Bern, I had to be interviewed by the ambassador. And when he realized I'd been in a university air squadron, he did some phoning, and he said, your instructions are to get back to your unit as quickly as possible. And he gave me petrol coupons, because to go through France you couldn't get any petrol at that time. And he gave me enough to get to Calais, where I had to leave my car in the hands of the SS, who didn't think I would ever see it again. But in fact, I did see it. They came back to me about a month later. I joined, through the university, a university air squadron, and these were set up, and they still exist, although they are beginning to vanish today. But quite a number of universities have them. And this was the RAF's attempt to entice students to join the Air Force. You could sign up and you got free flying instruction, but you had not committed yourself to join the Air Force. It was just to give you the flying experience, in the hope that at the end of it, you would be prepared to join up for good. And this I did. It was done at your local airfield, which is very handy. In Edinburgh, they had an airfield called Turnhouse, quite close by. And you went down there, mostly at weekends, and were given flying instruction. And it was really a very jolly club atmosphere, really. And you'd probably, over a weekend, get about 3 hours flying. And gradually you built up the hours like this, until you went solo and then got a little operational training. And as I say, then you had to make the decision whether to join up for good. I actually didn't sign anything saying I'd join up for good, because the time hadn't elapsed when I was asked to do this. I was still just one of the volunteers in the squadron. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. Once I came back to Britain from Switzerland, I was sent straight to an RAF station quite close to Edinburgh. But this was the period of what was called the Phoney War, and there wasn't much action going on. You did a little flying, but there was no action, enemy action at all. Although the Fourth Bridge had been bombed close by, unsuccessfully, but apart from that, it was all rather quiet. And in September 1939, the aircraft carrier Courageous was sunk in the Irish Sea, and with a lot of loss of life, heavy loss of life. And a notice went up on the board saying that the Fleet Air Arm was short of pilots because of this tragedy, and if anybody was interested in volunteering to join the Fleet Air Arm or transfer to the Fleet Air Arm, they could make an application. And I did this very thing and was accepted. And then the first thing they do when you get into the Navy, which operates in a different way from the Air Force, is they give you, I would say, just a little bit of refresher training connected with their way of operating. And of course, it's a nice time. As you say, this involves aerobatic flying and firing guns. It's all very good stuff for a young man. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And then you come up to the real crunch thing, of course, which is you finally have to learn to land on an aircraft carrier, which is not the easiest thing in the world. I was sent to a squadron, again based very near Edinburgh, which was working up to operate from the world's first escort carrier. And this was an actual captured German banana boat. It was captured in the Caribbean, and Winston Churchill had formed the idea to make it into a small aircraft carrier, and they sliced the top off, literally, and put a flight deck on it. And it was very small. We could only operate 6 to 8 aircraft. There was no hangar, and as is normal in an aircraft carrier, where they could be serviced and kept under cover. So they were all lashed down on the stern of the ship, and we had to trundle them out each morning to take off and rearrange them all the time. If there was a landing, you had to take them right up forward because a barrier would be put up in case the aircraft that landed missed the wires. So it was a very complex operation and very tiny deck to land on. And being a small ship was subjected to some very heavy seas. I mean, I have seen the rear end of the deck moving through an arc of 60 feet with heavy seas. And that is virtually impossible to land on. But if you're in these conditions, you have no alternative. And inevitably there are bad accidents in this sort of operation. But at the end of the day, it is a wonderful way of protecting a convoy. Because otherwise, if you don't have it, you have a German reconnaissance aircraft giving the U-boats all the information they want about the convoy, and nobody can drive this thing away. And it can also attack as well as the U-boats. But with our presence there, these things were driven away. So the U-boats were very short of information. Delighted, because at least there was action. And I had never seen an aircraft carrier in my life. So when I went out for the first time to see it, I just accepted that that's what we were to do. But there were chaps in the squadron who had already operated on large aircraft carriers like the Illustrious, etc., and they were utterly appalled at the size of this thing. I mean, it looked like a matchbox floating in the sea. But on a normal aircraft carrier, you have about 10 wires to pick up, whether you have an arrestor hook and it picks up the wires. This thing, we had only 2 wires to pick up. And if you missed it, there was a third wire, which was called the for Christ's sake wire, because if you caught it and pulled it out, the barrier would automatically drop and you would trundle over the barrier. You were hooked up. But if you missed all 3, you had a crash into the barrier, of course. The final attack is we had left Gibraltar to bring a convoy back to Liverpool. And from the very first night of leaving Gibraltar, U-boats were in the vicinity, and we realized a major operation was about to evolve because there were U-boats spotted everywhere or picked up on the ASDIC everywhere. And so we had a lot of patrolling and a lot of work by the convoys escorts, which were corvettes. And we finally, on the last night, were told that the likelihood of an attack was high. Now, we were the major target, obviously, and at night we had normally been in the middle of the convoy because we couldn't operate aircraft at night. In the middle of the convoy with two lines of merchant ships on either side of us. And if they were going to seek us out, they were going to hit these merchant ships. So the captain made a decision that he would take the carrier outside the convoy at night and zigzag around on our own, and we'd have better chance of protection. Unfortunately, that didn't work, in the sense that a U-boat hit us with a torpedo. Pretty lucky. It was a single torpedo, and it knocked the rudder off the ship. So we could still do our max speed, but we couldn't steer. And at night, of course, we could have been in grave danger of running into the merchant ships. So he decided to heave to and hoped that he had dodged the U-boat, because we really had no steerage and we didn't know whether we were going round in circles or what we were doing. But as we hove to, but I suppose 20 minutes later, the U-boat surfaced on one side of us. It really was an eerie sight, because as it came up out of the water, it was covered in phosphorescence. And eventually, the captain came up, or a German captain, came up onto the conning tower and just leant on the conning tower and watched us for a while. And you could see the gold braid on his hat quite clearly. They would be about 200 yards from us. And nothing happened. There was just this deadly pause when we stood staring at each other. And unfortunately, one of our sailors lost his nerve and opened fire with a machine gun on this, but with little chance of hitting it, but it probably at least it gave him some relief. And as soon as he did that, within seconds, the captain fired 4 torpedoes at us, and they all hit. And with that colossal barrage, the bows of the ship literally fell off. And, of course, as soon as they did, the ship tilted, very heavy angle, and all the aircraft, which were at the stern and lashed down by wires, these wires all broke with a resounding twang. And in the lull before this happened, the captain had called all people except the engine crew onto the flight deck. So there were some 400 men on the deck when these aircraft broke loose and wiped clean through them. So a huge number of casualties occurred in this way. And it was as simple as this. The ship was going down very fast, so you had to jump. And by this time, you're talking about jumping some 70 feet into the sea, because the back end's reared up. And there's grave danger that you might jump onto somebody, because already a lot of people had gone into the sea. So it was a pretty unpleasant time, and we lost quite a lot of people. In fact, a very lot of people. They had aircrew, like I was, had the normal aircrew Mae West. Now, this has the great advantage of having pillow behind your head, and your head is kept up. And if you fall asleep, for example, you're supported. The normal sailors in those days just had what was literally the inner tube of a tire and 2 tapes over their shoulders onto the tire. Absolutely basic. And in my case, when we went into the water, another pilot and myself joined up, and with 24 seamen who were around, and we were all in the same area, and we joined hands so that we'd hold each other and for a while, in case there were any spare little lifeboats. We had rubber lifeboats on the ship, and some of these were cast adrift. But there were none, they were all full when we got around to them. So we were left in that state. Now, we were not over worried about it because the corvettes were coming to pick us up. And we saw them picking people up all round us, and we were just waiting our turn, when suddenly, without any warning, they left. And we were the last 26 left in the water. And the reason they had gone was, as we learned later, they had had an ASDIC ping, as we call it, which tells them there is a submarine there. And the last thing they wanted was to be torpedoed with all these survivors aboard. So we were left for 6 hours, roughly. And, of course, during that time, this was December in the Bay of Biscay, and hypothermia sets in, and we all fell asleep. Although by this time we'd tied ourselves up together, and the seamen particularly just fell forward and into water, fast asleep, and nothing could waken them, and they just drowned, and we just had to cut them off as each drowned, till finally we were left just the two pilots with the support of the Mae Wests. And in the end, we were picked up. Fortunately, they came back for us. No, I wasn't scared, strangely enough. This I've read in books happens also if you get lost in the Arctic or the Antarctic, where you get hypothermia, and if you fall asleep, which inevitably happens, there is a grave danger that you will just, if you don't get awake, you will die. But there is no feeling of fear. It is just a feeling of you're just relieved to get rid of the anxiety, if you like to put it that way. I wasn't frightened because I felt basically that these ships the corvettes would come back for us. But sleep was welcome. It was a destroyer that came back for us, and she picked us up, just stopped and put ladders, little rope ladders down for us to clamber up these things. And in most cases, sailors or officers from the destroyer came down to help us. And I felt fine and had no trouble scrabbling up these things. But when I got onto the deck, I found I couldn't stand up. My legs just didn't appear to be there. And this is the effect of hypothermia, of course. But no permanent damage was done. The captain was a splendid man, and he really was very much admired by everybody on the ship. And when he had got everybody onto decks and made sure that everybody who could had cleared the ship, he and his navigator were the last to jump off. And like us, he was left behind, although not in our group, in another group, which we were not aware of at the time, but they were around us. And he, like us, was picked up by the same destroyer, and they threw a lifeline to him with a lifebuoy on it, and he put the lifebuoy on, and they were hauling him up when the rope snapped. And as it did, he was actually being pulled up the side of the ship when the rope snapped. And of course he fell forward, struck his head on the metal side of the ship, and fell back in the water and was lost. Very, very sad. At the end of 1944, it was obvious that the Germans were losing the war, and it was coming to a close in a few months' time. And Churchill set up a thing called the Farren Mission. Now, Mr. Farron was the director of the Royal Aircraft Establishment, the big aircraft research establishment, and he got round him a team of highly qualified scientists, aviation scientists, and pilots. And because I was German-speaking, he made me the commanding officer of the enemy aircraft flight, which was our main objectives were twofold. One was to, if possible, capture and fly back to Britain their highly advanced aircraft. And secondly, to go to their main research establishments, find out if there was equipment that we could bring back, and also if there were any German scientists who were going to be valuable to help us. So these were the two objectives. And to our utter astonishment, we found the Germans, although they had mainly vandalized all their piston-engined aircraft by smashing the fuselage or taking the propeller off, they had left all their jets and rocket aircraft absolutely intact. Now you ask yourself why. And my only theory is that they were so proud of the technological advance in these aircraft that they wanted us to see how it might have been if the war had gone on and they could have got the pilots which they needed and the fuel which they needed to operate these aircraft. But they're running out of both. And they destroyed all the documentation associated with them. So we knew nothing about how many hours they had flown or what they had done that way. And there were no pilot's notes to let you know how to fly them. And the German pilots were very uncooperative. Their attitude was they gave you name and number, which they have to do under the Geneva Convention. But otherwise, they were not about to help you. Ground crew, quite different. I think the ground crew were glad the war was over. And in Germany, the ground crew didn't have quite the same relationship with their air crew that we had here in England. There was a hiatus between them, and there wasn't much love lost. And so the ground crew were more cooperative, but they didn't have the main things we needed, like pilot's notes, etc. So we were very much on our own. But of course, we were used at Farnborough to flying aircraft for the first time with minimum briefing, etc. And anyway, I could read all the German signs in the cockpit, and we got by that way. And it was an Aladdin's cave of technology, absolutely marvelous. We couldn't believe it. And we brought a huge number of aircraft back to Britain. To give you one example, one of the first airfields I encountered when I went into Germany was in Schleswig-Holstein, a place on the west coast called Husum. And there they had a complete wing, and a wing is probably the order of 40 aircraft, of their latest rocket fighters. And they were virtually grounded because lack of fuel. They used concentrated hydrogen peroxide, which is the most volatile fuel you can imagine. But they were very short of it. So they were only flying if it was desperate and there was a bomber attack or something. So we had 40 of these there, and they were literally all intact. And we brought 24 back to the United Kingdom. And that was the scale of the operation. Now, we couldn't fly the rocket aircraft back. We ferried them back in a transport aircraft, but we flew all the jets, the main jets, back to Britain. The Arado 234B and the Messerschmitt 262, they were actually flown back. And we did all the testing at Farnborough. So it was a very exciting time. We got, and some wonderful engineers and scientists we found. We brought 26 back to Farnborough, and they were all brilliant in their own fields. And some of them were super brilliant, and these ones we were only allowed to keep them here for 2 years as prisoners of war. So in 1947, they had to be released. And before we released them, we asked them if any of them would like to stay and become civil servants and work at Farnborough. And the two brightest ones, we dangled very good carrots at them, and they stayed. And they stayed there for the rest of their lives. And indeed, one of them was a very bright man who was really the catalyst for giving us the design of the type of wing we should use for Concorde. And he was absolutely brilliant. And he was virtually the inventor of what is now called fly-by-wire, which is used in all the major airlines now. So we had some very good prizes. The first visit we made to Germany was actually before the capitulation, which was on the 8th of April 1945. But we flew in to an airfield near Hanover called Fassberg on the 18th of April because the Second Army had alerted us that 4 jets had landed at this airfield of Fassberg, their pilots obviously fleeing the Russians. And they had just dumped the airfield and fled, dumped the aircraft and fled. And the brigadier in charge of the group that had moved into the airfield was a medical man. And he heard me speaking German, and he said to me, you speak German well, and he said, I wondered if you could help in an operation we have to undertake in the next 2 days. And I said, I can't stay for 2 days with you, but I could give you a day if it's worthwhile. And what it was, not very far away, we entered Belsen concentration camp. And it's so horrendous, it's difficult to describe. There were bodies piled high everywhere in deep dug pits, but they were right up over the top of the pits. There were literally hundreds of them. And most of the inmates were women. 2/3 of them were women. And there were 6 huts there where they had been kept. Normally, I would say these huts should have housed 60 people, but there was something like 250 in each hut. And they were all lying in bunks, 3-tiered bunks with open slats. And whereas there should have been 1 in each tier of bunk, there was usually 3 in each. They were too weak to move. They were on edge of death, really. But they just lay there and messed through these open slats, and the one below and the one below that, and it was utterly indescribable. And the stench. We all wore surgical masks, and there were 20,000 cases of typhus. So it was a very delicate operation. And obviously I wasn't taken there for any medical reasons, but the brigadier said, what I want you to do is interrogate the camp commandant called Joseph Kramer and the lady camp commandant called Irma Griese. And Kramer was very easy to interrogate. He didn't try to make any excuse for himself. The evidence was too obvious there, and he knew he would be hung or executed. And it was very straightforward, and he admitted most of it. Irma Greta was a totally different story. She had been a guard at Auschwitz, the chief guard, lady guard at Auschwitz. And when the Russians looked as if they were going to overrun Auschwitz, she had fled to Belsen. And she was a very nasty piece of work and had been ruthless at Auschwitz, and equally so for a short time at Belsen. Anyway, we sat her down on a chair, and Brigadier said to me, ask her if she had her time over again, what would she do with it? Would she do the same? And she refused to answer. So I asked her about 3 times. She still refused. And then at the end of the 3rd time, she leapt to her feet and gave the Heil Hitler salute and yelled Heil Hitler and sat down, but wouldn't speak. So we took her out, I'm afraid, and she was hung a few days later. These were the worst aspects of our visit there, and they left impressions that you are indelible. You'll never get rid of them out of your mind, what you saw there. And it was the worst side of the Nazi regime, of course. And you ask yourself, well, was the German population aware of it? Well, I think in general most of them were, but they were too frightened to do anything about it. This was a totalitarian state, police state, and you got into very serious trouble if you didn't go along with what the regime was asking you to do. You can argue that if you take any country in the world, you'll get something like 10% who are rotten apples. And the only trouble in Germany was the rotten apples got control. And when they got control, then all was lost for the civilian population, really, because most of the inmates at Belsen were actually Germans, not foreigners at that stage. And people who had bucked the regime in some way or other. And, of course, a lot of them were there purely because they were Jews. But there were all sorts from races and creeds there. A truly dreadful thing. And the Second Army, interestingly enough, we didn't deal with the guards like, for example, they dealt with the major Nazis at Nuremberg. What we, or the Second Army did, was gave each individual a field court-martial. They didn't last very long because the evidence, we didn't have to worry about evidence. Nobody argued because it was there, all piled up. And so they were condemned to death. And with this Second Army was Albert Pierpoint, who was the official hangman in this country. And we hung, I suppose, or when I say we, the army did, the order of 200-odd guards. So it's really, but it was all done neatly, when I say neatly, quietly, efficiently, and giving them a chance with these courts-martial if they had any excuse at all to say it. But it was an easy operation. And look how neatly it went compared with Nuremberg, which is still today being debated about what went on there and was it the best way of doing it. Part of our brief or remit when we went with the Fern mission was to help the authorities if we came across any criminals who were loose in Germany at this time. And probably, apart from Hitler himself, the main targets were Goering, who was the deputy to Hitler, and the Reichsfuhrer Himmler, who was head of the dreaded SS. Now, we were in the Schleswig-Holstein area, mainly while we were operating, and it was known that Himmler had gone up to Flensburg, where Admiral Dönitz was based, because he had been nominated by Hitler when he committed suicide as the Führer. So Dönitz was up there with an SS brigade guarding him. And Himmler, of course, had gone up there thinking, I've got a brigade there and I'll help him. But Dönitz rejected him. So he was out on his own, and he stripped off his uniform, most of it anyway, and was just wandering around with a couple of companions. Nobody really knew where he was or at that time, but we were all alerted by the army to look out for him. Anyway, he was picked up at a small outstation by some soldiers who didn't like the look of his papers, felt they were not correct. And there were three of them, and Himmler and two others. And they were therefore taken into custody. But he said he was Heinrich Hitziger. And then he was passed up the line, and he got up to one of the, if you like, the more sophisticated outposts. And while he was there, they were questioning him, and he suddenly said he was Heinrich Himmler. They didn't believe him. The problem was, at that level, they didn't really know what Himmler had looked like or much about him. So the headquarters at Lüneburg was alerted, and an intelligence major there, with whom I had quite a lot of contact during my wanderings around Schleswig-Holstein, phoned me up. He knew where I was. There's an airfield close by called Celle, and he asked me to come up to the interrogation post because he knew I had been in Germany before the war, and I'd seen Himmler quite a few times at Nazi parades. And I had remarked to him that Hitler tended to have a peculiar walk. He rather strutted around. And he said, could I come up to this post? And he sent transport for me, and I went there. And once Himmler was very dishevelled and in a bit of a mess. But it was obvious to me, even before I asked him to walk, that it was him. Anyway, we did get him to walk up and down, and I also asked him a couple of key questions, which I thought only he would be able to answer. But I wasn't there to interrogate him, I was there to identify him. The interrogation was going to be done by the army. And so once we said, yes, we're pretty sure, he was moved up to the main headquarters. And there they examined him, and in the main they were looking for the cyanide pill, which every senior Nazi had with him. And the doctor put his two fingers into his mouth and was feeling around to see if he'd had it lodged anywhere, when he suddenly bit on the doctor's fingers, but with the object of biting the pill, which he succeeded in doing. And it takes about less than 10 seconds and gone. So after that, there was another problem with the question was some people with good political forethought realized that you had to bury this man somewhere where the Germans would never know where he was. Otherwise, they might find, well, they try to dig him up, the neo-Nazis try to dig him up and make a shrine of this body. So he was taken out at dead of night into Lüneburg Heath, and the pallbearers were 6 soldiers, and a young captain leading them. They zigzagged around until so nobody would quite know where they were, I mean, of the pallbearers. And I don't think the captain himself eventually knew where he was. But they buried him anyway and zigzagged back to base. And this was a very wise move, because to this day the neo-Nazis are digging away at Lüneburg Heath as if they were digging at Blackpool Sands, trying to find this body. And so it was well thought out. So that was the end of Herr Himmler. Well, certainly from an emotional point of view, seeing what I saw at Belsen, that is something which is ingrained in one's memory. You don't like to think of it too often, but it's something you can't wipe out of your mind. You can't, it's not only what you saw visually, it's, I can still smell the dreadful place. It was so utterly appalling. And I can also feel the anxiety, certainly I had, that I might get some dreadful disease from this place because it was quite ghastly. But you see, the people that went in were the medical corps, and so they knew what they were doing. And they didn't seem too perturbed, but they had, as I say, issued us with all surgical masks. So that was my most emotional experience, because up to that time I had had quite a lot of respect for the Germans. But on this occasion it all went out the window. I think the thing that stays with you about wartime is the camaraderie. Everywhere you went, you were with a bunch of other guys, and you all depended on each other. And people often wonder, why do these chaps all have reunions and stick together because of the war? It was because at all the time, doesn't matter where you were, you depended on these other guys to see you through in difficult situations, just as they depended on you. And we were all in the boiling pot together. And it's something that doesn't vanish with time. So that was it, the depth of loyalty, camaraderie that you had. I had never seen an aircraft carrier before. This was my first view of one. And therefore, I took it in my stride, because one had to take every experience that was thrown at you in your stride and in training. But as I realized, the people who had been on real aircraft carriers, by that I mean full-size fleet carriers, were utterly appalled at the size of this thing, which was tiny by the standards of the fleet carriers. And I frankly was not overperturbed at all with it, and I really rather enjoyed the kick of landing on this thing. It was a challenge, there's no doubt about that, but every landing on an aircraft carrier is a challenge, irrespective of size. But it's just I didn't know any better at that time. And of course, ever since, everything's been much easier, because once you've landed on the smallest in the world regularly, all the others suddenly become quite large. we were given, at the end of the war, Germany was divided into occupation zones. This had already been set up before the war ended. But whereas we had all been allies, the foreign nations, so allied nations, up to the capitulation on the 8th of May, on the 9th of May we all became competitors for the tremendous treasures that were there, technological treasures. And I had a lot to do with the Americans, and we worked very well together. And they wanted the same aircraft as we did, and there were plenty of them around, except for one particular type. We had quite a load of these Arado 234B bomber reconnaissance aircraft, and in the American zone there were none at all. So my opposite number, who was doing the same as I was for the Americans, asked if he could have a couple. And we said, yes, we've got quite a few, you can have two. And that was arranged. Then he came back and said that the State Department would like another two if possible. And I said, well, I think it can be arranged, but we'd like a little quid pro quo. Would it be possible to have interrogation rights to Field Marshal Goering? And he said, well, I'll see what I can do. And it was left at that. We gave him the two, and we just hoped that he would be able to achieve this. Well, he succeeded, and we were invited to meet Goering and interrogate him. But we were told we could not ask him any political questions because he was going to be taken to Nuremberg, and that would be their job. But I could talk aviation with him. And they, in the interrogation room, the Americans had positioned an invigilating officer to make sure I didn't ask any of the wrong questions. And he came in, and I have to say, I had always imagined him as a very large man, but the Americans had weaned him off drugs, and he was not looking his usual self by any matter of means. In fact, his uniform hung on him because he was so, had lost so much weight. But anyway, he was very po-faced when he came into the interrogation room. I think he'd been interrogated up to the ears and had enough. But then when he was told I was a pilot, his attitude changed completely. And he smiled, and he was quite charismatic, and said I could ask him anything I wanted. So the first question I asked him was, what did he consider was the outcome of the Battle of Britain? And he said, a draw. I thought the RAF wouldn't be very happy with that. So I said, well, can you explain how you came to that conclusion? He said, well, if you look at the official casualty lists on both sides, you'll find there isn't much difference in the numbers we lost. And he said, we didn't lose the Battle of Britain, we withdrew. And he said, we withdrew because Hitler commanded us to withdraw so that all his aircraft would be prepared and trained for Operation Barbarossa, which was the invasion of Russia. Now, this is perfectly true if you look through the records of what happened. So then he came up with what I call a reasonable answer. Not one that would satisfy us, but at least it makes you think, because there was a lot of logic in it. And maybe with the other key question I asked him, I said, why did Germany never have a heavy bomber force like our Lancasters and the USAF's flying fortresses? Because obviously, if you were going to conquer Russia, you'd have to attack their industrial complexes in the Urals, where they were making hundreds of aircraft and hundreds of tanks. But he said, well, the Führer was against it because he didn't want a long war in any area at all. He believed in the Blitzkrieg, a quick war, and he said that we did in Poland and France and Belgium, wherever. And he said we were going to hope for a blitzkrieg in Russia. Now, many people will say, what an extraordinary thought, you could have a blitzkrieg in Russia. But if you sit back and think of what happened, when the snows came, and which is what stopped the Germans really, they were actually in Moscow. And if they had started, as had been their original intention, to start their invasion a month and a half earlier, they would have avoided the snows up until they got there. But above all, they would have given their logistic support time to get there. What happened was they were in Moscow, but their logistic support hadn't caught up with them and would take about a month to catch up with them. And this, of course, they could not survive without logistic support into what had been their major towns and see the absolute, when it's almost indescribable chaos, the destruction that our bomber command had wreaked on these towns. And there were still bodies around too. The Germans just had run out of people to clear these places. And you never forget it because you think if it had gone the other way, this would have been the boat we were in. And in spite of all this utter chaos, as I say, the Germans were doing incredible things in maintaining the war effort. For example, at the end of the war, they were working right up to the last day of the war on some very advanced weapons. Very advanced weapons. And I really mean right up to the last day of the war. So they were fighting. They never gave up. This is what I think might impress the youngsters, that they were a nation that, because it was their country, not everybody agreed with what Hitler did about going into Poland, going into France, going into Germany. But when it came to defending their own country, when we were likely to go in there, you didn't have to ask anybody. Everybody was fighting to preserve their homeland. And even the children. When Berlin fell, the Hitler youth, boys of 12, 14, 16, were armed and fighting tooth and nail against the Russians. Quite incredible. And I think our young people should realize that if you love your country, you must be prepared to give a lot to it. This is what I find difficult now that we have so much immigration. Will these people ever feel the same about trying to preserve this country as the people who were born here feel about it. It's a difficult one in modern things, but that's why I'm fully in favour of this indoctrination of those that want to stay in this country. They've got to learn to be British. Because if they're not British, they're not going to fight for us if the chips are down. I started off the war in a spirit of adventure. You're young and, frankly, you're a bit suicidal when you're young. And to me, it was a glorious adventure to begin with. And I loved it. I mean, combat in the air didn't particularly worry me at all. In fact, I rather, in some ways, relished it. Then gradually, my views changed when I began to see some of the real horrors of war. For example, on our convoy trips to Gibraltar, we had ships that were sunk by U-boats, and of course there were people that were injured, and we had a hospital ship with us. And the Germans, they bombed the hospital ship from the air, and we had some horrid injuries to the people, and they were all transferred onto our aircraft carrier. And we had a doctor on our aircraft carrier, an RNVR doctor, and he on one night did something like half a dozen amputations of major limbs. And he asked the pilots, because he thought we'd have strong stomachs, to come down and act as amateur anaesthetists. He showed us what to do. We didn't have any complex equipment. It was more or less chloroform and holding it on their nose for such a while, and then timing how long you do it and then taking off, this sort of thing. But you were there and watching amputations and that sort of thing. And that began to change my mind into a different phase. And I realized the ugliness of war. And then, of course, I think I went through the full gamut when I went to Belsen, and I saw what horror really was. But even after Belsen, walking through these completely destroyed towns, seeing virtually towns that had vanished. There didn't seem to be any place where you could live. And there were still bodies and bits around, and the whole thing began to make you realize at the end of the day, war is a unforgiving business and achieves little. So it molds your character, and that's why I think so many of people of that era are accused of living in the past. You are living in the past because these things are so embedded in your mind that it's very difficult to get rid of them. I mean, I probably think about what I saw at Belsen every day of my life. But it's how you're affected. It didn't make me frightened of anything, it just made me horrified that human beings could treat other human beings in this way. So it's a period of drastic change, and it occurs normally if you're in the fighting forces at an age where it impinges very heavily on you.